Hi, Heather.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Hey.
I'm doing well. Is that what you asked? Did you ask him, how am I doing?
No, gosh, you can call me out for being rude right at the beginning? No.
No, I didn't. I just honestly couldn't hear exactly what you said. And I assumed, given your reputation for extreme politeness, that you had said, how are you, Bob? But if not, you haven't, I'll tell you anyway. I'm fine.
Oh, it's 2019, and so many women's reputations for extreme politeness are going to be so blown up this year. What I was saying, though, which was equally polite, was
Amy Klobuchar's already in trouble. Go ahead.
How delighted I am to be back in the Bob Wright Blogging Heads motherlode.
Well, you're orbiting, I don't think you orbit motherloads. Let's give up on this metaphor. Anyway, we should say that you do appear on the Hurlburt podcast, which is part of the Blogging Heads constellation with Dan Dresner. Not as often as we might like, but you do, and you talk about foreign policy, and you're also at New America Foundation, where you are, director of the New Models of Policy Change Project, which is excellent, because the old models, so far as I can tell, were not panning out. You also write regularly for... That
name may be the smartest thing I have ever done in think tank world.
Did you come up with that name?
I actually did.
Wow, that's genius. New Models of Policy Change. What's not to like? It's part
only
of
if you're highly invested in the old models.
Yeah. Well, I still go back to the days when they called it the New America Foundation. That's when I had an affiliation there. But, then they got rid of all things archaic, including me and the word foundation. Let me say more about you. Write this really good column kind of thing in New York Magazine. It's kind of like an explainer from a certain perspective of recent foreign policy events. That's a good gig.
It is. It's a great gig. It's foreign policy for real people.
Another great motto. You're just that ranks right up there with New Models of Policy Change, if you ask me. Foreign policy for real people.
My speechwriter background gives me away every time.
You wrote speeches for Hillary Clinton. Is that true?
I wrote speeches for Hillary Clinton. I wrote speeches for Bill Clinton. I wrote speeches for Madeleine Albright. I wrote speeches for the late lamented Warren Christopher. I wrote speeches for Bono.
Warren Christopher. Now I'm nostalgic for the era when they would get an actual professional diplomat to be Secretary of State. I mean, he took a lot of grief for reasons I don't really recall, but he was Clinton's first Secretary of State?
He wasn't actually a professional diplomat. He was a professional lawyer who made it really, really good. He was a poor kid from North Dakota whose folks moved out to California for his dad's failing health. His dad died. He scrubbed toilets to get through college, became a trade lawyer, made good, worked in government, was of the generation that actually thought government service was a calling and that you stopped making money when you went into government service. That itself is enough reason to be nostalgic for them.
Yeah. Those are the days, boy, before the world started falling apart. But we're going to fix all that because we're going to talk about the much discussed search for a progressive foreign policy vision. You hear a lot about this search. I haven't paid as much attention to it as I should. I think it's safe to say that clarity and consensus have not been attained yet. I have my own dog in this race, or horse in this race, dog in this fight, whatever. The phrase progressive realism is one I've been trying to impart some momentum to for some time. I've championed it very sporadically over the last 10 years, starting with a piece I wrote in the New York Times. And then there's a piece I wrote in The Nation a couple of years ago that maybe we'll link to. But anyway, so I have my idea of what a progressive foreign policy vision should be. I think it's safe to say it's one you don't entirely agree with. And I guess I want to start by asking you, since you're in the business of keeping track of these things, am I right that there's no, for all the talk, we haven't even gotten to the point where the competing visions are sorted out? Like, it's like you can't, there's no clear taxonomy to be done, right? Like on the socialist left, there's this foreign policy vision, and then the barely left of center neoliberals are championing this, and so on.
Well, I think there's actually both a couple of points that there is pretty broad agreement on and a complete crisis of taxonomy, and both happening at the same time. And the sort of two places where I think there's a lot of agreement is, first, the idea that actually American democracy and the survival of American democracy is at the center of, or has to be at the center of, American foreign policy in a way that none of us has been used to talking about it, in this generation.
Okay, but what does that mean? I mean, we've all always been in favor of the survival of American democracy. You mean it's now imperiled in the age of Trump, or what?
Yeah, and that's something that you see foreign policy professionals from sort of Tom Wright of Brookings on, maybe the establishment left, to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in their or whatever the heck Sanders was, in their foreign policy speeches late last year, rolling out, really, there were elements, and I've written this, there were elements of Warren's speech in particular that could write in his Atlantic articles on the subject. So the idea that the combination of Russian interference in our democracy, our own sort of attempts to dismantle our own democracy, and the rise of tools that frankly make it possible for anybody to interfere in anybody else's democracy in ways that make, and I'll just go ahead and quickly mention this because I know the listeners are filling it in at home, the ways we used to interfere in other democracies throughout the Cold War kind of look pretty simple by comparison, that has to be foundational to how you think about U.S. relations with the rest of the world.
It's funny, when you said there are two things everyone agrees on, I was about to interject, I'll bet you I don't, and I have to say, I'm not thinking of this as being at the center of my foreign policy vision, but go ahead.
Okay, and then the second one is that the willy-nilly injection of American armed forces into conflict is a problem, or is a non-productive approach which needs to be reined in. That one, how far you want to rein it in, there's a difference, but you can get pretty much everybody out there to say, yeah, there's been overuse and under results from the injection of US military recent years. So, so those are two, pretty good practical places to start. They would mark a pretty significant turn from where we are at the moment. And so back to your sort of not wanting democracy at the center, or not wanting American democracy at the center of your foreign policy vision. I've been writing and grousing to whoever will have me on that one of the real crises in the conversation around progressive foreign policy is how reluctant we are to answer the question, for what? And here, this is maybe one of our first big sort of taxonomic splits. And are you a climate change millennial or Gen Z globalist who wants to get rid of the whole idea that there's such a thing as U.S. foreign policy for America? There's always been kind of a strand of that, what we'll call the utopian left, and it's really staging a comeback right now among younger voters and activists in particular, and with climate as their leading issue.
You mean that American interest should not be the focal point?
That there is no such thing as American interest divorced from global interest. Now, I don't entirely buy this. I'm somewhere between where I think you find yourself in the realist part of your progressive realism and where we see some of the climate activists placing themselves. But I do think folks who sit in the Foreign Policy Academy are maybe not following this particular development among younger progressives, which puts strain on the foreign policy debate from a level that you and I are maybe not used to seeing, but it's a very real strain.
I'm curious, where do you think I sit on this issue by virtue of the word realist and progressive realist?
You have your own pretty focused and idiosyncratic definition of what American interests are. And the last I checked, although like I said, haven't been on here in a while, your definition of American interest doesn't start with establish an equitable global order and provide reparations.
Well, actually, I mean, I just published a piece in the Physical Wired magazine this month on newsstands now called Make Globalism Great Again, which, it doesn't talk about global equity, but it talks about steering global governance to the left to address, existing instruments of global governance like NAFTA, the WTO, to the left by virtue of heading off some of the forces that got Trump elected president. But certainly on global warming, I'm easily on the left, and I certainly, my book Nonzero was an argument that the U.S. is involved in more and more non-zero-sum games internationally. More and more cooperation is going to be needed, and then that's why we're going to nurture instruments of global governance. And certainly climate change is a classic non-zero-sum problem. So what distinguishes this is what distinguishes my realism from all the realisms to the right, is precisely how important I think global governance and international law are. Yeah.
And that's where you and I tend to meet in the realism space, because one of my great frustrations with realism has always been that it is very unrealistic about the power that accrues to international institutions and norms. So a realism that is sort of small r realistic about the power of those things.
Well, what you mean, traditional realism accords? Traditional realism kind of almost ignores that stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Traditional realism says, none of that stuff. If you can't shoot it, it doesn't count.
Yeah, and my view is, I think that's not. The interesting thing about realism in general, is that it's unusual in referring both to a description of the world and a prescription. Not all things are both, but in this case, I think that's not so inaccurate as description of the world. That is to say, international law is honored more in the breach than in the observance, and so on. But prescriptively, I think if you understand where the world is headed, where technology is driving it, you have to conclude that whether or not international law is respected now, whether or not bodies of global governance are effective now, we're going to have to make international law more respected and global governance more effective in the world we're moving toward, precisely because of the number of non-zero-sum games. You could also describe much of that as interdependence.
It's so funny. I think I wind up being exactly orthogonal to you in that I think prescriptively we miss important things about how the world got the way it did over the last 20 to 40 years if we ignore the role played by norms, the role played by efforts to enforce norms and laws, even inconsistently. Mm-hmm. And forward, I gotta say, I don't like being this pessimistic, but I am quite pessimistic about our ability to create, or anybody's ability to create. Actually, no, that's not quite true. I'm quite pessimistic about the ability to create and enforce democratic and humanistic international laws and regimes. Different from saying I'm pessimistic about the ability of large entities to create and enforce international regimes.
So what you're saying, the portion of international law that concerns itself with things like human rights and nurturing democracy, you're pessimistic about? Is that?
No, more broad than that. Over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, we've moved away from formal international law, which is to say norms that are passed, norms that are ratified, and toward informal international law, which is to say norms that are negotiated by groups of interested parties, never put to a formal ratification process, don't have any of the legal or juridical value that we think of when we...
What would be an example of that latter thing? The classic of the former would be the UN Charter and various agreements done under its umbrella. And also, I think you would probably say regional agreements, maybe like NAFTA and so on, would be in the former category, or...
Right. And in the latter category would be the entire machinery of internet governance, which is mixed, private. Much of the Paris Climate Accords, which are really nothing but a set of promises that countries made to each other that have none of the legal binding force that, say, the Non-Proliferation Treaty had. Speaking of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we could add the way that we've all just kind of decided to live with the small but very significant number of countries that, decided to never cede to the NPT, and there's nothing we can do about that. The number of treaties that the U.S. used to abide by without ratifying and now is not even necessarily abiding by in some cases. So moving for some time, and this is not Donald Trump's fault, I want to jump in and say here, this is a bigger, longer term trend. We've been moving away from formal international governance and toward informal models, which in some spaces give more representation, give more legitimacy, and in other spaces serve to freeze out actors and to decrease legitimacy. And so which of those trends you think is going to win going forward, I think depends on where you think power is going to reside and what trends you think are amplifying sort of a diverse kind of power that can build international cooperation that benefits large numbers of people and diverse interests versus where power is accruing in ways that benefit small numbers of people and concentrated interests.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against combinations of relatively informal agreement and norms that get the job done. I mean, if you can make real progress on climate change that way, that's good. And that certainly doesn't preclude the system evolving towards something more formal. I think the one place I really want to respect international law in a way that I don't think all that many people want to, it has to do with this question. Like if I was going to ask people who profess to have a progressive foreign policy vision or any foreign policy vision, like a few kind of litmus test questions, one would be, what are the criteria for using military force? Like you said, everyone on the left agrees we've used a little too much. Pretty much everyone, including many people who championed the Iraq invasion, now understand that was a mistake. But I don't hear a lot of clear rules. And here's my candidate is, if it's not a matter of literal self-defense, in other words, you're not attacking someone who has attacked you, and you cannot get the Security Council of the United Nations to authorize the use of force, in other words, you cannot make it legal under international law, in effect, then you don't do it. Okay? We wouldn't have done Iraq. We wouldn't have done Kosovo. We would have done the first Persian Gulf War. We would have done the Afghanistan War. Those were both sanctioned by the Security Council. I'm not saying all the wars that we would have done under that.
We would have done Libya, God help us.
Well, we would have done the first half. There's disagreement over whether once we went into regime change mode, that was not exceeding the mandate. There's, that's a whole argument. But in any event, if you don't do Iraq, you're in much better shape. I mean, we could also, I hope we'll have time to talk a little about Syria. I also think that there was a form of proxy intervention we did that was a big mistake. But anyway, that, respecting international law in this realm would be would exert restraining influence on our military interventions. And it's at least a clear criterion. And I also think, that I think it's important to nourish respect for international law. So there's that second virtue of adhering to it. So that's one thing I'd say. I mean, do you think that's not a good rule of thumb?
Well, I want to ask you a question about it, which goes back to the conversation that we were just having. If the value of international law is that we think it's good law, then there's that if we made those laws, we should live by them. If the value of international law is that it's supposed to produce benefits in how others behave, then we've reached a point on use of force norms, but on an awful lot of other norms also, where the foreign policy establishment told Americans for 50 years that by signing up to these norms and adhering to them some of the time and talking about them a lot, even when we didn't adhere to them, that would produce benefits for Americans in how others behave. And we're in a bit of a crisis right now where one political party has been seized by people who simply don't believe binding the United States to any international restrictions whatsoever is in our national interest.
Yeah.
So
well, the truth is, let me stop.
This is completely different from the question of what should govern the U.S. use of force. But I don't want to have to go out and have a conversation with the American people on the basis of a set of rules that the people I'm trying to convince have already decided don't work for them.
Well, let me suggest that the problem,
not the hill I want to die on, I
Let me suggest that the problem is larger than you seem to think. It isn't
I sketched out a pretty damn large problem there.
Well, no, but the fact is the entire American foreign policy establishment has been indifferent to our own compliance with international law. You hear all this moaning about how Trump has abandoned the rules-based international order. Heather, you know, we have not consistently abided by the rules-based international order that we set up, and I think that's half of the problem. And that's one reason the rest of the world has increasingly treated it with disrespect. Now, as for the problem that the Trump voters who think about these things, and I don't think we should exaggerate the number of Trump voters who have actually thought about international law one way or the other, or Americans in general have thought about it. That's actually a problem I get into in this Wired piece I mentioned. We'll link to this on the Blogging Heads TV site version of this. But it's a challenge. There's all kinds of things that are challenges. If you don't share my conviction that it's imperative for the future welfare of the United States and the whole world that we nourish respect for international law and build up a body of global governance, then you will not think it's worth the trouble to try to fight the politics. I personally think it's imperative, and maybe that's where we differ. You can imagine a world that's still going, you apparently can imagine a world that's just going swimmingly 100 years from now, given all the technological developments we'll see, even though there's very little in the way of respected international rules of the road and laws.
I don't nothing about going swimmingly, Bob. I actually have great difficulty imagining any world that's going swimmingly 100 years from now. I'll just put that on the table. Right.
Well, so you don't think international law would help? You just think it's going to not go well regardless, or what?
We are going to be going through so number one, as many critics note, much of the world hasn't gone swimmingly for much of the people in it for the last 100 years. So there's really, I don't think there's anything that you and I are discussing that's going to usher us into a utopia in the next 100 years. So that's point one.
True.
Two is, if we can't shore up respect for law at home in major global powers, international law is meaningless. So I come back to my point about American democracy being core here, because if we're living in a world where either we're we're stuck with a government that minimally respects the law at home and is no longer on a trajectory of gradual improvement in the ways in which the U.S. famously hasn't respected the law at home, hasn't respected the law for all of its citizens, we can't possibly have any level of respect for ourselves overseas. We can't do very much around a Russia, a China, a Turkey, a Saudi Arabia that love a set of international laws which they can make formalistic claims about us violating while they violate with impunity anytime they want to. So I love international law. And just to go back to something you said earlier that I find really deeply offensive, like many members of the air quotes foreign policy establishment, many of us spent lots of time in government fighting like hell to get the U.S. to do a better job of living up to its commitments. And there's just lots and lots of people who spent lots and lots of their lives. The idea that the U.S. doesn't is really offensive. But if there's no adherence to or declining adherence to rule of law at home, international law has even less meaning than it currently does.
Yeah, but I'm talking about compliance in a pretty strict sense, and I do think you'd be hard pressed to find members of the foreign policy establishment, which is, say, people who have had actual power, who on a consistent basis paid a lot of attention to it. I mean, Kosovo intervention is a perfect example where,
you're just wrong. We just disagree on that, Bob, because I didn't have actual power. I was only religious, but I did sit in the room for a lot of what went on during the Kosovo intervention. And I watched people agonize. And I watched people who felt that there were two parts of international law that were in fundamental conflict. And one is the rule about how you initiate violence, how you initiate the use of force through the Security Council. And the other is the rule about the sanctity of human life and the sanctity of self-determination. And they felt that two portions of international law were in conflict. Now, you can disagree, and I think there's a legitimate reason to disagree with the decision that they came to, but it is not the case that those folks didn't care about international law.
Well, I mean, I think, international law is for better or worse and for worse, sufficiently amorphous that you can always find grounds for agonizing. But it seems to me that if you look at the very origin of like the United Nations and the Security Council, I don't know. I think Kosovo is a pretty clear call. You look at what is defined under the UN Charter as the legal and not legal use of force. And if it's not clearly in self-defense, you need the Security Council's authorization. You didn't have it. Let me say one other thing. And in any event, there certainly wasn't much public op-ed level discussion of this, and there never is. In the public sphere, there just isn't much expressed concern with the whole idea of international law. But let me say one other thing is that I admit to being old-fashioned in the sense that, I think my view, and I could be wrong, you probably know more about this than I do, is that the original conception of international security under the UN Charter was in a certain sense a pretty realist conception, in that the big emphasis at the time was on preventing transport-or aggression. So long as you didn't aggress, quite a bit of respect was paid to sovereignty, right? In other words, to the extent that there is focus in international law on the internal affairs of countries, that's been an emphasis that's been later to evolve, right? So, for example, the right to protect is a doctrine that came along later. So I would say that part of my progressive realism is believing that the original there's something to be said for the original kind of realist emphasis on the UN Charter. And I may have that wrong to begin with. So I'm curious about what you think of my conception of the history of it, and then you can disagree with my emphasis.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the original realist conception of the UN Charter, which was that France had a swath of the world in which it was entitled to do whatever it wished. The UK had a swath of the world in which it was entitled to do whatever it wished. The U.S. had a swath of the world, which in 1945 wasn't as big as it quickly got thereafter, in which it was entitled to do whatever the hell it wished, and ditto the Soviet Union. So if you were a country or a recognized group of people that hadn't yet managed to achieve national status in one of those places, it was too goddamn bad, and those words in the charter didn't apply to you. So yes, that's
wait, they did apply in the sense that, you mean if you were like a surrogate country within the Warsaw Pact or something, they didn't apply to you? Or
if you were a Warsaw Pact country, if you were a colony in Africa or a colony in Latin America, or if you were India, then too damn bad. And so, yeah, the original realist construct of the Security Council and its 5 great powers is not a construct that holds up very well in the sort of post-national liberation, post-1960s, and then post-Cold War environment.
Actually, I would think in a way it would hold up better in a post-colonial era. There are very few formal colonies. So if your objection was that the charter didn't protect colonies, that doesn't apply so much anymore, right? There aren't many colonies.
The realism of the charter applied to those 5 countries, and with the assumption that large swaths of the rest of the world came under their domain, and whatever difficulty came up there would be handled by whichever.
So you're referring to the veto, the fact that they have veto power. Oh, okay, okay. So
I remind you, is the reason that the Security Council couldn't authorize Kosovo, not because there wasn't a majority on the Security.
Sure, and it's the reason that we wouldn't have gotten permission to invade Iraq. And if right. Both things had happened, and if we'd respected both decisions, we'd be in a much better world. Whatever you think of Kosovo, we all agree we'd be in a much better world if we'd respected the wishes of the Security Council in those 2 cases. But now I see what you're saying. So it isn't so much about colonization; it's about the inequity of power represented by the whole idea of only 5 countries having veto power in the Security Council.
Yeah, the realism of the system that created the Security Council.
But, although
that those 5 countries could do whatever.
That wasn't quite what I meant by the realism. But you're right that international law is exercised under that structure, and I would love to see some reforms to that structure. But international law is exercised under that structure is in some ways like American law, in that rich and powerful people are advantaged and they have good lawyers and don't go to jail, and poor people go to jail. Those are both extremely regrettable. I think we should do what we can about them. I'm just saying in both cases, I actually think we're better off trying to do something about them than just resorting to a world of complete lawlessness.
Yeah, I think we agree on that. It's very funny that I find myself sort of cast as the anti-UN and anti-international law person, which is not my view at all. To come back to the sort of original thesis about what's core to progressive foreign policy right now, just to me, the core things that I want to see progressives thinking about and arguing about and talking to progressive voters and undecided voters in the run up to 2020 is, how does what the U.S. does overseas relate to who we are and how we live at home? And I think you and I agree that the story that we've been telling about that, number one, didn't get updated after the Cold War, and number two, is kind of fundamentally no longer quite valid in that we have a set of ideas about whether and how trade is good for us, whether and how intervention is good for us, that are, somewhere between a little bit out of date and flat out flaming wrong, depending on who's doing the talking. And that as our progressive conception of who we are as Americans changes and grows, and I think that's happened in some really positive ways in response to this president, that has to be reflected in how we talk about who we are and what we do in the world.
Okay, well, do you have, so you're talking partly here about military intervention, but you're also talking about what our policy is toward, for example, dictators. Do we engage? Do we sanction them? Do we engage with them economically? Do we sell them arms? You're talking about that whole spectrum of things ranging from military intervention to non-military forms of sanction and support.
I'm also talking about economic policy, and I'm also talking about all the things we do that don't come under the level of the label of coercion, like sanctions, and so they get much less airtime, but they're arguably the most useful and beneficial things we do. So, for example, the whole scope of things that we could be doing in Central America to try to help people build viable and safe communities for themselves so that they wouldn't want to make the terribly dangerous journey to our border, some of which we were doing in a kind of inadequate way, all of which this administration has now stopped doing. We never talk about that. When people like you and I have conversations about progressive foreign policy, that rarely gets mentioned, but it's incredibly, incredibly important, both for the folks involved and to help defang this terrible fueling of racist and energy that tears at our civic fabric here at home. So I want to shift what we talk about when we talk about foreign policy as progressive.
Yeah, I can tell. But you do agree, I assume, that part of a foreign policy has to involve having some criteria for how you treat different kinds of countries, and when there are seeming inconsistencies, having some kind of rationale, right? Like, for example, like the standard, let's look at three people: Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia, authoritarian, pretty ruthless. Sisi in Egypt, I would say more manifestly ruthless. He's gunned down hundreds of his own people who were just peacefully protesting. It wasn't even like a civil war, it was a protest. Bashar al-Assad, whose crimes are well known. And
you could add Aung San Suu Kyi just for fun.
Well, you could, but that now we really do have a lot of variables to control. But it's just kind of taken for granted that we say, well, Bashar al-Assad is so bad, like you shouldn't even talk to him. But the Sisi guy, we're going to support him. We're going to say that his coup wasn't a coup, and so on. Now, to my mind, there's just a problem there. There's just a glaring inconsistency, and I would not support our existing policy, and I can describe how. But I don't have to. My main question is to you: is that a problem? And if it is, what would your rules be? Are you happy with that set of relationships?
Well, number one, I'm not defending anything that this administration currently does.
Yeah, but Barack Obama chose not to call Sisi. Okay.
I do think this administration shows the danger of saying, above all, you have to have a principle on which policy is founded, because this administration principle is if it's good for the Trump family and Republican Party politics, then heck yeah, we'll do it. So that's a pretty clear principle. So having
not the kind, I hope it goes without saying that's not the kind of principle I would embrace. But go ahead.
So I want to speak for imperfect principle as compared to sort of Trump administration. They have a principle, they really stick to it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very comfortable with principles that you try your best to don't hit the mark 100% of the time. Would I have pushed the Egyptians harder than Obama did? Yes, I would. Would I have pushed the Saudis harder than Obama did? Yes, I would. But am I basically comfortable with Obama's attempt to balance his principles around human rights with his pragmatic idea that in general, the U.S. should be trying to move to a situation where Middle Eastern countries were more responsible for their own destiny and where possible we should get out of the way? I think that's a good principle, even though I have plenty of quibbles with how he implemented it.
Do you think, but you are against withdrawing military support for Saudi Arabia and Egypt?
I am against waking up tomorrow morning and saying we're going from 100 to 0 in either country. Yes. And
what would be the? I mean, I don't ever advocate going from 100 to 0, but what is the great peril in your mind of ceasing to supply them with weapons?
Well, I'm totally in favor of cutting off support for Yemen. There's been warning about that for years. That's I mean, it's not, but it's straight. You mean
support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. And support and U.S. participation in the form of refueling. Just to be clear that one is way far over any line that either of us has. And there should for years have been, I mean, the interesting thing, of course, is that Obama did make a really radical move with Mubarak that, no one in the Middle East had seen before or since from American foreign policy. And then didn't quite know what to do after that.
Right.
And we ended up where we are now. So could you have been willing to impose more consequences on Sisi at various points for his behavior? Absolutely. And say you have choices. Now, there are also limits to that. Let's be clear, because the Saudis and the other Gulfies are quite willing to keep propping Sisi up, even if we won't. So one of the things I think
let them do it.
People have to be careful about is not promising that, like magic, if the U.S. starts sanctioning people we don't like, that will produce happy effects.
I'm not talking about sanctioning. And what I'm saying,
sanctions in the sense of creating consequences.
Yeah, consequences like, we don't have to sell you weapons. That's not the same as the kind of economic sanction we're imposing on, say, Venezuela or Iran or any of that. We just don't have to give you the weapons that we actually don't give to all countries as a matter of strategy. Just quickly, I would say the Obama administration's failure was really quite egregious. I mean, if you've read David Kirkpatrick's book about that episode, they just never sent a clear signal, a truly clear, unambiguous signal to Sisi. We don't want a coup. And if you do it, you're on your own. No more weapons. They didn't come close to saying anything like that. I would have said it. I would have meant it. If he went ahead with the coup, I'd say, enjoy your new Russian patrons. Screw it. I don't understand what the big downside of that is. I really don't.
Well, I want to say that the tragedy of that is how difficult it was for the Obama administration to make the turn it was trying to make. This is again back to Mubarak, but I was really taken aback to learn that, sort of while the White House was saying one thing, Chuck Hagel was calling the Egyptian military and saying something really different.
And John Kerry wasn't being super constructive either, but go ahead.
So I think, maybe one of the reasons that I'm a little less hopeful about sort of having really clear principles guide U.S. policy in an incredibly consistent manner is having seen up close just how difficult it is to make that happen in reality, which doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about principles. It does mean we should be, and part of, I think, the challenge or the problem that American foreign policy has had in the past is our tendency to overpromise at home. And I think those of us who want change also have to be careful about not overpromising.
But can you tell me why it is so difficult? What political or other kinds of forces were impinging on Obama such that he was unwilling to do what I've just said, which is perfectly clear, a perfectly simple thing to do in principle. You send the message, you call him personally. Obama has a phone. you call him personally, you lay down the message. Why was Obama either afraid to do that or what? What was the problem?
So Elizabeth Saunders at Georgetown has actually done some really great writing on this and has a new book coming out, I think, later this year about the sort of subtle political coalitions that American leaders perceive inhibit them on foreign policy decisions, which is that this perception is really interesting. But if you take the Hagel case, right? So Obama perceives that it's politically helpful to him to have a Republican Secretary of Defense, right? So he picks Hagel, which we could have a whole other blogging heads about.
Yeah, no, Hagel is not Metternich. I think we agree on that.
So then, once you have your Republican in place, you have to treat him nicely enough and not humiliate him publicly enough so that he won't do what Mattis did to Trump at the end of last year, because it used to actually matter if your Secretary of Defense did that kind of thing. Now it doesn't, but here we are. So you are therefore going to make choices about either how much you make policy that your Secretary of Defense opposes. We could go back to Gates in the first Obama term and look at the decisions that were made on Iraq and Afghanistan. Same basic set of constraints that you very actively perceive that you're doing a certain set of things to keep your sort of Republican on board, because you perceive that keeps the right flank of your own party quiet. And again, we can argue, and I know we could argue until the cows come home about whether that threat from the right flank of the party is real, but we have a long history of Democratic presidents perceiving that it's real. And I think that Trump put up with Mattis for as long as he did. We have now sort of evidence of how that works on the other side as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also curious, why does the right flank of the party care so much about Egypt, period, if the assumption is that they did? So let's, I could elaborate on this. I think I won't bore us anymore with progressive realism. We will link on the Blogging Head site to my piece in the Nation, which is probably the most concise version of it. So why don't you, tell me, are you, with the original question of about a taxonomy, are there people saying clear things? I heard a really, an interesting, Lawfare podcast with Jack Goldsmith and Samuel Moyne of Yale, whose work I wasn't that familiar with, but that was interesting. Moyne seems like an interesting guy. What are there people who's other people who are saying things on the left about a foreign policy vision? They're actually putting an actual vision out there.
Yeah, I think there's two different there's two different vectors that conversation is happening in right now, and both of them are really interesting, and they don't speak to each other all that much. And one is, and that the conversation you just cited is kind of a great, new generation of the classic debate between liberal interventionists and progressive realists, right? And so Moyne, who's got a really bracing, painful skepticism about human rights policy, is his core academic expertise. And if folks aren't familiar with him, as I said, you'll find it some combination of bracing and painful, depending on where you're coming from.
And he's skeptical about our ability to constructively intervene in a consistent way or something?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think the record somewhat bears him out. It's related to what you just said, because it partly has to do with how hostage the policy is to domestic politics.
So that kind of conversation, and then, there's the kind of the other vector that's playing out is between, say, Peter Beinart and Tom Wright, who are both sort of writing frequently on this in the Atlantic. A really good kind of institutionalist case coming from Mira Rapp Hooper and Rebecca Lissner. She's going to kill me. I don't get her name quite right. Which appeared last spring, and looking at what is left of international institutions and how do we think about U.S. approaches to international institutions if there's less left of them than we would like. So that's all fermenting in a really interesting way. And I'll modestly say that Texas National Security Review ran a roundtable of 5 or 6 progressives. I'm one of them, but there's a bunch of others, which take on some of these issues in a really interesting way late last year. I also highly recommend their conservative roundtable, just to sort of understand the full spread of of where conservatives are and what their key points of difference are. But then, while all that's happening, the two presidential hopefuls who've pronounced themselves on foreign policy so far are Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them have put out a progressive foreign policy vision, which is very economically focused and very linked to their core sort of domestic critique and domestic vision. And they're actually both very substantive and very thoughtful. And what I'm really looking for is kind of the grand synthesis that picks up their critique and hooks that to various positions in the kind of internationalist, realist debate. I should say that I think if you balance sort of them on one side of the economic debate and some of the things that Jake Sullivan, who worked for both Obama and Clinton, has been writing, which I would call a slightly chastened globalism, is a way of looking at the two sides on the international economic.
Is there a way to characterize the basic difference between the Sanders and the Warren visions?
They focus in slightly different areas, sort of as you would expect. I think Warren's more thoughtful on the competitiveness in international economic piece, sort of coming, I think, out of her thinking about the banks. So she's got more kind of detailed policy chops there. Sanders, especially the work he's done over the last couple of years on things like Yemen, comes with a little bit more, people are a little, he's got more positions you can point to on the positions. But really the two speeches are really compatible. I wouldn't say to you, there's this key thing they disagree.
And there's this big profile of Matt Duss, Bernie's foreign policy advisor in the current issue of The Nation.
Well, thank you for mentioning that, because you will give me an opportunity to say in public sort of the thing because I'm quoted in that piece and really fun.
I was interviewed, but my quote didn't make the cut. You're obviously pithier or something.
Whoops.
I'm not that I'm bitter.
Well, so I think on behalf of Ben Rhodes and myself, Bob, maybe I can invite you to be the third charter member of the Matt Duss fan club.
I've long been a fan of Matt's. I mean, I think, sometimes people, they get their picture on the cover of a magazine like The Nation, and you think, I wish I'd been nicer to them. I think I've been pretty nice to Matt, but I'll have to go back.
Well, I'm sure you have been, but I'm trying to make the cheeky point.
Yeah.
First of all, lots of us on various sides in the foreign policy, on the left of center foreign policy community, get along a lot better than you might think. And point two, that actually Matt is somebody that lots of people respect from different positions within Democratic foreign policy circles.
I
don't want to ruin his reputation by saying that.
But you know why that's impressive is he has a pretty forceful presence on Twitter, right? He's not he's not just trying to minimize the social blowback on Twitter. He's saying things, and yet he is pretty, I think he's widely respected. I think he's widely liked by pretty much everything to the left of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And who would want to be liked by them? God knows I don't, and am not. But, he's very impressive, guy. And it would be great. It would be great to see. It's, the only, I could see voting for Bernie on grounds of foreign policy alone, but we'll see. I'll certainly.
I want to be sure to sneak in a couple of other issues that I think are percolating around in the campaign context that some of which you sort of do expect and some of which you don't. One of which is, I think we're going to have a big conversation about nuclear weapons in the 2020 presidential campaign. And you and I are both old enough to remember the last time that happened, but many of our viewers probably aren't. So I find that fascinating and at some levels quite helpful.
Wait, the last time being the 25th anniversary of the NPT or the last time being the Iran nuclear deals?
I was thinking of the 80s rather than the Iran nuclear deal. No,
you mean the Reagan, the whole Reagan thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we are. I mean, and maybe, this is a question I'm sure a question on people's minds who have followed the stories about the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, if that's what it's called, but that we kind of suspended and threatened to get out of, and the Russians said, well, actually, we're going to beat you to it or whatever, is that apparently we think Russia is violating it. I mean, a lot of people in America who oppose Trump's policy here say Russia is violating it, but we shouldn't get out of the treaty. Can you explain why those two beliefs are compatible?
Yes, because I actually am one of those people.
Right.
So, since the Obama administration, the U.S. has been making various remonstrations to Moscow about a new missile system it was building that pretty clearly, in our view, and in NATO's view, violated the treaty. The reason not to willy-nilly get out of it without a really strong and well-coordinated plan with NATO for what comes next is that one of the primary purposes that treaty served was to reassure Europeans that nuclear weapons were not going to be stationed on their short-range nuclear weapons were not going to be stationed on their territory, and even more importantly, were not going to be exploding on their territory. Mm-hmm. And you just take that away, and then you put stuff in your budget, as this administration did, that you're now going to sort of run full speed ahead, developing these weapons, which if you point them at Russia, they can't explode in Russia. They can only explode in Europe. That's why they're intermediate range. So the Europeans look around and say, this means that you are not committed to our safety at the same level of certainty that you were before. Mm-hmm. That's yet another kick to the alliance. So it was just a dumb thing to do.
Yeah. Okay. I'll take your word for that. Now, just I think you're going to tell me you have to go at the top of the hour, so maybe we should give you a little more time to talk about your own view of foreign policy. I mean, it sounds like a couple of your emphases are making American democracy work in a way that, in some sense, maybe fosters a productive foreign policy or permits us to be responsible and influential actors in the global stage. And then I think you also, I think, are concerned with like global equity issues. Am I right in thinking these are two angles you're approaching it from?
So my pithy way of putting it is we make a mistake if we think that American democracy can be healthy without thinking about the state of the rest of the world. That the sort of fantasy of democracy in one country is just that. Mm. And so that means you gotta realign what you do internationally, thinking about how does this make the countries we need to be our partners stronger, and how does this discourage countries that want to come in and that are able, and that we can do a lot to make it harder, but we're an open society and it's going to be possible to mess with us forever. We're not going to change that. So. Mm-hmm. Things that we do. And this means, thinking about international economic relations in terms of, are we building broad-based prosperity in other places? Are we building narrow-based prosperity? Are we being honest with ourselves about, we have this fantasy that Google and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Facebook are American corporations that have the interests of the American government first? Well, no. Let's just go back and start from a position of realism about what the 21st century economy looks like, and what the relative power that the U.S. government has in relation to that. How could that change? Mm-hmm. Security-wise, where would precipitous movements of troops, precipitous changes in policy make things worse? Would changing, shifting, pulling troops out, inviting other countries to take charge of their own security, where would that actually be helpful? That's not going to be the same answer everywhere. Just because you can pull troops out of place A doesn't mean you can also pull troops out of place B. So those are the kinds, last point. We need and I actually think progressive domestic politics can help us.
What was that first word? I think we lost that. A really what and progressive?
Dramatic rethink and progressive domestic politics can help us in thinking about what the best way of supporting people around the world who want to have the rights and freedoms that we either have or are fighting to get and keep here. And that means not being afraid to talk about them, but also not sort of clinging on to ideas of human rights and democracy promotion that are pretty discredited. So that's my core set of concerns.
So the idea, the versions of democracy promotion that are discredited would be, broadly speaking, kind of what categories? I mean, you have everything from, the Iraq War was supposedly in support of democracy to much subtler intervention in Ukraine, but still not nothing, and enough to certainly annoy Vladimir Putin. What categories of democracy? And then there are whole other varieties. Of course, there's the long-term fostering of civil society, in a longer range sense, and so on. What kinds of things do you think have been most discredited?
Yeah, so regime change doesn't work. Just off the table, full stop. Mm-hmm. Long-term subtle. So a couple of sort of specific examples, Macedonia. Basically, my entire professional life has been defined by Macedonia fighting with Greece over its name and also fighting with Serbia over its right to exist. There's never been full-on conflict there, and that's because of more than 2 decades of U.S. and EU constant, low-key, non-violent, but security as well as economic and social and political engagement. That's a success story. You can take sort of another one that's more militarized is actually Ivory Coast, where only because of the intervention in Libya was there also an intervention in Ivory Coast where someone had legitimately won an election, his predecessor was refusing to leave. It was a very targeted military effort that didn't spread and get bigger. Winner of the election was able to get in place. Democracy goes on. Totally non-military, someplace like Kenya, where there's a terrifying amount of electoral violence, but it hasn't ever spilled over into full-on civil war, or East Timor, which is not anybody's idea of it's not the Luxembourg of Asia, but it went through a civil war. The civil war ended. It's been able to reemerge as a somewhat functioning society. Even, say, Afghanistan, a real success in Afghanistan, the proportion of Afghan women who actually have a medical professional with them when they give birth has gone from under 15% to about 25%. That's something that you can feel proud about when you get up in the morning. Now, should it have come with 17 years of military intervention that hasn't bought us a stable government? No. But there's a whole host of things that the U.S. supports that actually do work if you sort through with a really thoughtful lens.
I guess as long as we brought up regime change, I have to ask you about Venezuela. I mean, there's one form of regime change the Trump administration and a number of other countries are engaged in. They haven't yet used military force, although I will say, did you see that not Hugo Chavez, but Maduro said that they intercepted an arms shipment from Miami that was, did you see that? I mean, it's Elliot Abrams is in town. I mean, so what is your view on what the administration has done so far and what may lie ahead?
A military intervention in Venezuela would be catastrophic. It's a terrible idea. It shouldn't happen.
Including by proxy with arms shipments and things?
We have the problem that there are right-wing Venezuelans in Florida who are trying their hardest with the support of people close to and inside the Trump administration. What I'm sort of worried about is creating a fait accompli, where you get Venezuelan Americans doing something that they then have to be rescued from by the however many thousand troops that Bolton wants to stick in Colombia.
So you mean the starting of a civil war, in effect, or an insurrection that makes us feel duty-bound to intervene?
Yeah. Yes. No, that worries me. That worries me hugely. Now, the other thing that I want to be really, really clear about is that Venezuela is a humanitarian catastrophe. And 3 million people out of a population of, I believe, 31 million, if I'm remembering correctly, have left. The majority of whom are in Colombia and Brazil. And that's just an unsustainable catastrophe for those countries. And so you can understand the anxiety of neighbors to do something that pushes Maduro toward the exit and starts dealing with the human. Mm-hmm. So you got both of those things on the table at the same time.
Final Venezuelan question is closer to factual. I don't know the answer. Some people on the left complain that a certain amount of the suffering in Venezuela is due to sanctions, in particular, I guess, Obama-era sanctions. But I've also heard that actually those sanctions mainly targeted elites and weren't broad-based in the way that does a huge amount of economic damage. Do you have a view of like what the actual situation is there?
Oh, yeah. No, this administration has ratcheted up sanctions pressure in just an effort, as they say in Russian, тем хуже, тем лучше, the worse, the better.
Mm-hmm.
So and look, all sanctions trickle down and hurt ordinary people, and regimes are expert in making them do that. So just when you use sanctions, that's a thing that you do. But the Trump administration has not really made any effort to avoid inflicting pain on ordinary people. They've made the deliberate calculation that you want to separate Maduro from his working class base as quickly as possible.
So Obama tried to tailor sanctions that wouldn't hurt the grassroots too much. Inevitably, you would say to some extent failed, but not hugely. Is that your view? And what was the rationale? What were the sanctions for?
To try to starve the government of the oil wealth that keeps it functioning and also enables it to keep getting assistance of various security forms from Cuba.
But I mean, what was was there some transgression on the part of Venezuela that was the official reason for sanctions?
String of totally unfair elections.
Okay, well, God, if that were grounds for any form of intervention, we'd be doing even more than we are. Including, but that's what I mean. Okay, so how can we, on the one hand, support Saudi Arabia and the current Egyptian regime, and I could go on, and on on the other hand, find some country that's had a crooked election and impose an economic sanction? That's not remotely consistent.
So the only possible response to that is that the question is not whether you're perfectly consistent, but whether you're consistent enough to have the desired effect anywhere. And if you have the desired effect anywhere, then people will still want you to come along and have the desired effect elsewhere. People want, for example, Trump, for heaven's sakes. Well, they want Trump to speak out about Aung San Suu Kyi and the Rohingya, despite what he's supporting in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, because they believe it would make a difference and save lives in Burma.
Well, we're a powerful country. It would, but I would say that in my view, there is this negative externality from this inconsistency, which is our word carrying a little less weight, the more glaring our hypocrisy and inconsistency is. And I think that's a real cost. And then B, we get back to what I said. In my view, it is imperative for us and for the planet that we build and respect a coherent body of international law. And you just cannot be as glaringly hypocritical as the United States has been through a series of presidential administrations and do that job in an effective way at the same time. That's just my view.
So the only thing I'm going to say about that to kind of round out the conversation is that this history of international law is a history of glaring hypocrisy from whoever was the hegemon at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the amazing thing, in my view, about the liberal international order period is not that the U.S. was more hypocritical than anyone who had come before, but how much advocates and civil society were able to use the tools provided by international law to achieve, despite the hypocrisy of the folks who had the power. So, my elegy for the liberal international order is not that it was devoid of hypocrisy, but that it created spaces within which its own hypocrisy could be fought and challenged. And that's
good, but I just hope it leads to less and less hypocrisy. And I'm just saying the system will be in trouble if it doesn't. I mean, if you look back at the evolution of national law in America, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, things happened in places like New Orleans that you would go, are you kidding? They just decided to lynch this guy, and the local courts and police basically said, fine. I mean, law is an evolutionary process. And, although there are still great deficiencies in the application of American law now, on balance, it's a more lawful society than it was at various times in the past. And I just think international law can it's an evolutionary process. I just think we have to commit ourselves to it in a way that really I don't hear very many people agreeing with me about, honestly.
Yeah, and I mean, my view is the because we're now going backward domestically, I think, both in the consistent application of the law and in who the law is consistently applied to, which is the other great triumph of the last 100 years, is not just that we applied the law better, but more of us got its full protections. That the route toward making any kind of international rules that work better starts with making sure that we're on safe ground with our own, getting back to a path of continuing improvement in our own domestic rule structure, which, as you can tell from throughout this podcast, I feel pretty frantic about.
Okay, well, I will give you the last word then. I'll add an asterisk to what I just said, just for the sake of clarity, because I know the term lynching is used broadly now. I was thinking of a specific case in New Orleans, described in the book, I think, Empire of Sin, where the citizens just broke into the jailhouse and took a guy awaiting trial and lynched him. And then that was validated by like the whole legal system. That's what I mean. That's the kind of thing that happened at one point. And that I'm happy to say I don't think I've seen in the last few decades. So thank you, Heather. This has been a great conversation, I think. And we will link to, you've written a piece for Lawfare that's relevant. You've written a piece for Democracy that's relevant. You were part of the roundtable you described. We can link to that. You are on Twitter. You are NatSec Heather, NatSecHeather, where NatSec stands for National Security, I assume. I've never asked. I'm Robert Writer on Twitter, WRIGHTER. Is there anything else you want to plug?
I think, you like more of this foreign policy in simple English sentences. You should check out my columns at nymag.com. I
mentioned those. They are a great resource. And we'll link to, you did a Venezuelan one already, didn't you?
I did.
So we'll link to that.
I'm sure I'll find myself doing another one.
I don't doubt it. Okay. Well, thanks so much. And people should also watch you and Dan Dresner on those occasions when you do grace us with your presence, which I might add is not as often as some of us might like. But it's on the Blogging Head site, and it's its own podcast feed called Dresburt, DREZBURT. Thanks a lot, Heather.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
You too.